Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be here with Steve O'Hare. Steve is a technology executive, a former journalist, and founder. He's currently VP of Strategy at Zapp, the UK startup building the future of convenience retail. Prior to Zapp, he spent nearly 15 years as a technology and business journalist, including over 10 years as a reporter for Techcrunch, where he focused on UK and European startups, companies, and venture capital. In addition to TechCrunch, Steve has written for numerous other publications, including ZDNet, The Guardian, The Sunday Times. The list goes on, but I really want to jump into our conversation. We'll be talking about the state of tech journalism and Steve's move to strategy in convenience retail. Hi, Steve. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
Good, good. To start us off, I'd love to hear a bit more about your background. So, did you have a specific aha moment when you went into journalism, or was it more of like a steady draw?
So actually, I wanted to be a journalist as a kid. So I was one of those unusual people that actually wanted to go into media and managed to actually get into media, right? So yeah, ever since I was a kid, I wanted to be a journalist. I think I wanted to probably be like a music journalist originally. I was like fascinated by the idea of like writing album reviews and just kind of covering the music scene. And then I applied to university to study journalism, but the course that I wanted didn't have wheelchair access. Students were seconded to the local newspaper, accessible. So in the end, I didn't even study journalism. I just sort of studied generally media. And then after I graduated, I go and work in some sort of tech web design stuff. And I ended up doing that and didn't become a journalist. Long story short, one of my projects got covered by a national newspaper. And I said to the journalist, hey, I kind of want your job. Can you introduce me to your editor? And he did. And that's kind of how I got my way in. So, yeah, if you don't ask, you don't get, is my takeaway from that story.
That's definitely what we've been hearing throughout the conference today. Were you able to blend music into what you were doing when you were doing tech journalism in some way, or did you have to leave that part behind?
I mean, from the music, because music was like, in a way, the way I got into technology. Like, I wanted to like produce music from home, and back then you didn't have many options. But I was lucky enough that when I was like a teenager, kind of computer, and that was actually interesting how I got into technology. I was like, computers can be quite an amazing tool for creativity. I need to know how they work, right? And then how software is a tool for all sorts of disruption, including the music industry. And then obviously when I went to university, I studied media and got into kind of digital video editing, and that kept my passion for tech. So yeah, it's through the creative industries that I entered technology for sure.
That's really interesting, actually, because right at the beginning of Adventure Emerge, we had Dr. Merritt Moore, this quantum ballerina. She blends her interest in quantum physics and ballet. And we talked a little bit about this sort of artificial separation of STEM and the arts that's been going on for a long time. And I think now maybe we're seeing a little bit more of what innovation can come out of mixing the two. And so it's interesting you touch upon like that creativity aspect. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Do you think like the cutting edge tech we're seeing now has enabled us to think a little bit differently about this barrier between arts and science?
Yeah, no, so I think it's an absolute false like dichotomy. If you actually go back a little bit in history and look at the early development of the Apple Macintosh, and you go and you can find it online. There's loads of great stories about that early team that developed what became the Apple Mac and the kind of graphical user interface that we all know today. And that team was multidiscipline, right? It like had musicians, people into theater. It had like graphic artists who all happened to just be like computer engineers as well. And so just kind of by accident, or maybe because that was the team that Steve Jobs recruited, maybe he recruited for that. These were people that were incredibly into the arts, and arguably that is also why the Mac, for example, very early on had a graphical interface that could support notation, like music notation, because these people are thinking, well, you can't do that on the old technology, but we want to be able to do that on a computer. So I think when you blend different disciplines and the arts versus the sciences, I think then some really exciting things can happen. And I also just think, and I caught a bit of that talk yesterday, and I think there is a false divide between the left and the right side of the brain. And I totally relate to the idea that when you're at school, like if you're good at maths, they tell you should probably don't do science or something with computers. And if you're good at kind of writing like I was and other arts, then oh, that math stuff's not for you, right? And again, it's an absolute false divide. And I think what it does is it kind of drums out that ability to have lateral thinking. And I think in entrepreneurism or in any kind of form of creativity, and I think there's so many parallels between, say, like I've made my own documentary, right? Creating a movie in itself has so many skills that are shared with entrepreneurism. Hustle, trying to get around a problem, trying to do things very resourcefully. Like my documentary was made for like less than $10,000, right? So like, and yet you're told in school, particularly, that you're either kind of scientific, artistic, and I think it's ridiculous. And I also think if you extrapolate that to like the way those industries operate, those two industries, the creative industries and the tech industries, are notoriously bad at talking to each other, right? They almost have a different language, right? And you see that with sort of the early days of sort of Napster, the music industry. You know, they were like literally like two different planets. And I also think, and I know I'm going on a bit of a ramble here, but I think some of the issues that creep into technology, some of the less good ways that technology can be used, or certain unintended consequences, are probably a result of not having an interdisciplinary approach to some of these topics.
Absolutely. And I think that's so interesting to think about, because you have people writing the code that's going to control every aspect of our lives, essentially. If we don't have a diverse range of people giving their perspectives into that, there are so many potential ramifications that we can't even predict. So having people with range of backgrounds and experiences is so important in tech. So you touched upon just briefly your documentary there. I'd love to hear more about that, and also maybe how you've seen the skills that you gained through making that come out in your new role as a VP of strategy at Zapp.
You know, for sure. So it was a long, long time ago in 2004 with a bunch of friends, actually. They just all happened to be filmmakers and creatives, and we had a little bit of funding, and we went there to make our own documentary. A kind of the narrative was, you know, three people from London go to Silicon Valley to try to discover what it is in the valley that encourages and fosters and nurtures so much innovation, both historically and obviously in the future. And so we went there. We lived in Oakland for a month in this awful one bedroom apartment. I mean, it was all guys, and the place kind of reeked by the end. Like, it was horrible. Um, and we had like hardly any sleep, and we did miles and miles and miles around the valley, interviewing and talking to people from various like famous companies, but also some people on the ground. And the takeaway of the movie was that actually a lot of the innovation in the valley, back then especially, maybe now it's become a bit kind of money orientated again, but a lot of the innovation was basically people that didn't grow up in the valley. They weren't born there. They'd gone there to pursue their own dreams. And so you have this kind of network effect where people that have the, I guess, the bravery and the ambition and the ideas to want to go and, you know, quote unquote, change the world, instead of staying where they are, they head to the valley, right? And then they meet other people that also have that kind of self belief, or that ability to tap into an idea that doesn't yet exist, right? When people elsewhere might say, "Hey, you can never do that. It's never going to work." But in the valley, there was this mentality, this kind of can-do attitude. But the takeaway of the film is that it's an imported mentality. It's not that the valley creates it; it's that it attracts people that already have some of that. And then at the time of the film, it was very shortly after the dot-com bubble had burst. So a lot of those people had left the valley and gone back home. And so there was also this kind of idea that they, in turn, had exported that secret sauce. So in a sense, it's a product of importing talent from around the world, and then they got to go home again and take some of that mentality with them. And I think if you fast forward to today, and you see tech ecosystems and networks in all sorts of cities all around the world, that has kind of played out to be true, but on a much bigger extent. And then you asked about sort of links between creativity and my role at Zapp. I mean, my role at Zapp is to work with the founders across the business and to kind of make sure that some of the things we're doing internally align with our business goals, but also align with some of our principles, right? So we can probably get into this later, but we're quite big on sustainability, on kind of ethical working, and yeah. So my job is to get a bit involved in anything from the communications. Sometimes I'm interviewed on behalf of the company or aligning on sort of internal policies, and even a bit of getting involved in some product development and recruiting. So it's quite a varied role, and I guess that probably links back to if you are a creative person, but you've also been involved in technology, you can perhaps speak the various different languages to be able to float around on different projects and different teams inside a company that is now like we're well over 1,500 people. So this is not like a tiny startup anymore, even in a year, right? We're a year in existence. So I guess that ability to be kind of interdisciplinary, have lots of different kind of career backgrounds, it proves useful in a fast growing company like Zapp.
That's something that's so exciting that we're kind of moving away from this idea of just linear career paths that you choose, you make your bed and you have to lie in it and that's it. But rather we're trying to think, okay, I've done this thing and I'm seeing so many interesting things come up in different areas. How can I use these skills somewhere else? So I'd love to hear how you had when you first had the thought of moving away from tech journalism to join Zapp. Like, when did you meet the founders? When did you decide to do that? And was it scary? Did you have this pressure to sort of stay in tech journalism?
Yeah, no, I'm like I like to pretend I'm really decisive, and it's all like some kind of amazing plan. But I definitely took a while to really make the decision. So what happened is, so you got to imagine like you've had a year of the pandemic, right? I was in lockdown for the entire year. I'm still basically shielding because if I got coronavirus, it would be pretty bad. So but I spent a year in total lockdown. I had thrown myself into work, so I broke so many stories for Techcrunch during that first year of the pandemic. I was kind of at the absolute top of my game as a journalist, but when work becomes your entire life, you start to focus on, okay, is it really giving you the challenges that it used to? Does it excite you as much as it used to? Does that stoop you got last week, did it feel as worthwhile or as good as a few years ago, right? And I came to the conclusion that I'd got a little bit too comfortable. Like it had probably got a little bit too easy um, or repetitive, and I definitely wanted to change. And this was like 8.5 years back at TechCrunch and 10.5 years at TechCrunch in total, right? So definitely had done my time and built obviously an amazing network within the European tech ecosystem. So then I was like, okay, I think I'm ready for a change. Ironically, TechCrunch were paying me better than they ever had done. So it wasn't like about money, it wasn't anything like that. But I thought, okay, I need a change and this pandemic's not going away. So I need to like figure out what I want to do to kind of make life a bit more fulfilling and keep that excitement and that hunger. And at the same time, because everybody had gone to remote working, like that also opened up so many opportunities because it's not so easy for me to travel into work and stuff. So I kind of mainly need to work from home. And suddenly all of these companies that were like anti-remote working were like embracing remote working. So honestly, for me, my career had kind of improved during the pandemic just through hard work and, like I said, being at the top of my game. And at the same time, the world had become a bit flatter for someone with like a disability like mine. So these two things converged, and I started to network a bit more and kind of very softly phone good contacts up and were like, hey, think I might be ready for a change. Like what's kind of out there. And I haven't really told this story, but I had two really, really good parallel job offers that really, really interested me. One was actually to stay in journalism, but with a slightly different role, and one that I could bring on and mentor the next generation of journalists, and that was like super exciting. And then the other one was Zapp, which was like the outlier. It came about because I was trying to break their news. I was trying to like be the first journalist to talk about their funding because they have some great investors. And I'd known the founder, Navid, like for more than 5 years because I covered one of his early startups and we kind of stayed in touch. And I think I just let it slip to him on the phone. I was like, hey, I'm thinking about leaving TechCrunch. I've got this other great offer. And he was like, well, hey, why don't you come and work for us? And I was like, well, what would I do? And he was like, well, what do you want to do? And the conversation developed from there. And I think that's just very lucky, good timing, good network, and super privileged to be in a position in my career where someone kind of wants to hire you first and then figure out what you're actually going to do second, right? So, and then, yeah, like I said, it took me ages to really decide, because do I want to go and do a journalism job again? Or do I want to enter a crazy, fast-growing startup with an embraced kind of uncertainty? And yeah, I went for the latter.
I think it seems, from what I've read, to be a very exciting move. Although Robin Waters just messaged and said they miss you very much in the tech journalism world. But I'm sure they're watching very keenly to see what you do next. So you touched upon previously Zapp's focus on sustainability, which I find really interesting, and particularly in this space of convenience retail, which is a very competitive. I'd love to hear more about that, and what Zapp does differently, and why you're so optimistic about that.
Yeah, sure. So Zapp, on the face of it, is obviously it's an app that lets you order kind of convenience items. So, drinks, snacks, essential groceries, even things like over-the-counter medicine, or nappies at 2 a.m. It's one that I like to say, and all the things the items where you may want it or need it right now, right? So think of like spontaneous socializing, like friends pop round. There's nothing in the fridge. You want to or you want to have an after party, right? So we're really popular with students. I should mention that. Or it could be something like, a spontaneous celebration, getting champagne into someone who's got engaged, like all those kind of things where you want to be like living in the moment, or things where you need to save the moment. So like if you're out of a certain item or whatever on short notice. But what people don't realize is behind that bag of chips, potato chips, or behind that bottle of wine is an entirely new kind of supply chain that we're building, which means that we act as both the retailer and the last mile delivery service. So unlike, say, a Deliveroo, where you're sending gig economy riders into other people's restaurants or other people's stores, we operate the full value chain, right? And what that enables us to do is potentially by augmenting it with technology and by starting from scratch, we can build a more efficient supply chain, one that is fit for the 21st century, that is capable of getting what you need or what you want right now faster than any existing supply chain today. And if you're going to try and do that, and it's a massive, 10, 20-year mission, you want to do it by building sustainability in from the get-go. So really early on, our founders made, I think, quite an ambitious decision to employ an all-electric fleet. So our riders use electric bicycles and electric mopeds. And then also to, think about food waste and partner with Olio for food sharing. So unsold food goes back to the community, and, look at the green energy suppliers for the stores. And also we've just invested in a central distribution center. And what that also means is that we can like procure like products centrally. And then when we need to replenish the stores, so when a store runs out of an item, we're more in control of how we restock that store. So we can also look to invest in electric vans to do replenishment. And they're just the first things we're doing, right? But for a startup that is, about a year old, to be investing already in some key components in a sustainable way, I think is testament to not only doing the right thing, but also really understanding what our customers want. And I know with the climate change conference and stuff, there's a lot of talk about what governments need to do, but I think it all comes from consumers and what they expect from these new challenger brands. And I think at Zapp, we're seeing our customers appreciate this, they care about this. And to be honest, in the 21st century, like they probably wouldn't expect anything less, right?
I think in such a competitive space, that's something that would make Zapp stand out. Like for me, if I had a choice between ordering from different apps, knowing that that's what's behind Zapp and knowing that they're putting that effort and that foresight into it 100% for me and for many people I know, and particularly Gen Z consumers. That plays a huge, huge role. Super excited you mentioned Olio as well, because Tessa's coming on to speak with us. I'd love to talk a bit more about the responsibility of journalism in advocating for sustainable tech, for example, or other things, essentially holding people to a higher standard. What do you think is the responsibility that falls on journalism to maintain standards, not just in sustainability, in different areas?
So, I mean, the main mission of journalism is to hold power to account, right? And if we think about startups, startups eventually become scale-ups. And in a sense, many venture capitalists invest in future monopolies. So these are not just startups that become scale-ups. Eventually, they could be a winner-takes-all market. Now, I don't think the market that Zapp's in is a winner-takes-all, but there are definitely markets where eventually it trends to one main dominant player, right? And this is potentially a bad thing as well as a good thing, depending on how it plays out. So I think a journalist's role is to hold power to account and to have the foresight that some of these startups are going to become very, very powerful and have huge impact. And when I think about impact, I always try to educate people that it's not about necessarily some huge feature or some huge policy. It's actually that just a little change can have huge impact just because of that scale. So if you have a product that's used by millions of people, if you do something a little bit good, that's a little bit good times a million. But if you do something a little bit bad, like that's pretty shitty at a million or 5 million, or in Facebook's case, like billions, right? So that's how I think about impact. So I think a journalist's job is to be the checks and balances or play a part of that. And even if you can't necessarily like uncover some big scandal, part of it is just asking the right questions. So if we think about sustainability, Sifted did a great piece on this. They kind of asked, is the rapid delivery space sustainable? Can it ever be sustainable? And I was lucky enough to be in the piece.
That was going to be my next question.
Yeah. And that's great because they were asking the question, and they were asking the question super early. And even though the argument that I made to the journalist was partly that it's a little bit too early to hold some of these startups to the highest bar of sustainability, given that we have limited resources very early in the journey, and you can only invest a certain amount of your capital into some of these areas initially, and obviously as you grow, you need to be investing more. And I should add that Zapp, we're very much at the beginning of the journey on sustainability. I think it's a great start, but we have much more to do. We've just hired a head of sustainability. They worked actually, I'm lucky they worked directly with me, so I'm partly responsible for that brief. And I know that our plans, are only going to get stronger and stronger, and we're thinking way further ahead related to what I said about building that new supply chain, right? So a journalist's job is like to ask the questions and to be the checks and balances, but also to add the context the reader needs to make up their own mind. So, as I said to the Sifted journalist, happy to answer questions, happy to admit that it's the beginning of a journey and it's not conclusive. That rapid, convenience can be exponentially more sustainable or not. The jury's out and X, Y, and Z. So put it in the context of a company that is about a year old, and I think we're doing.
You touched on here the good sides of sort of journalism holding people accountable and what they can do to encourage people to talk about things more, to question things more, to reflect, particularly when you're dealing with new industries where we can't, as you mentioned, we can't foresee all of these things quite yet. What do you think the bad sides of that are? You've said to me before that when accountability loses sight of fallibility, we're in choppy waters there. So I just wanted to expand on that a bit.
So these are all judgment calls by journalists, right? When journalism loses nuance and doesn't take the time to explain that a lot of issues are grey areas, right? Then I think we kind of don't do justice to the readers, and we kind of insult the readers slightly, and you fall into kind of Twitter outrage. That's the temptation, right? So I think what I meant when I said that you need to accept fallibility. So what I think I meant was that you need to remember it's about humans, it's about people ultimately, and I think that when I was a journalist, I always tried to remember that behind every headline, behind every story, whether that be a company being sold too early, running out of money. I did some coverage around furloughs and people being laid off in my last year as a journalist, which was the pandemic, right? There's always people behind the story, and that people make mistakes and people are going to make judgments that they thought were good at the time, but look terrible later on or whatever. Do you know what I mean? So I think that to not accept that people are fallible is to not accept that we're human.
Yeah,
And I mean, this is our private chat, but yeah, I think that was the more profound point I was making, that in the end,
absolutely.
and I think during the pandemic, I love that kind of meme that kind of spread about being kind to one another. And I think part of accepting that we can all make mistakes and we're not perfect is to be kind, because, it's like I said, otherwise we turn everything into kind of, we're not algorithms, we are people.
Definitely. And it also denies the concept of people can make progress and we can change based on feedback. But do you think from writing about things from a journalist perspective, sometimes it can be easy to forget that aspect that there's a human behind the story, or to overlook nuance?
So I think journalism is quite underfunded. So I think part of it is a time and resource issue. So if you're having to turn around a story really quickly, maybe sometimes it's easier to lose sight of the people involved, or to really take the time to understand the nuance, right? So I give an example. I did a piece before I left Techcrunch, and it was a bit crazy because I don't really know why I did it. I kind of regretted it slightly. I wrote 8,500 words on Klarna, the buy now pay later company, and it tried to understand what is Klarna and is buy now pay later a good or a bad thing, because there were tons of stories coming out about how terrible it is in the UK. And I kind of concluded that before you can decide whether Klarna is good or bad, you have to kind of figure out how you feel about credit, full stop. Like, is it okay to lend people money and then get them to pay back and make a profit? Right. And until you figure out how you feel about credit, you can't really make a judgment on how you feel about Klarna. Because if you accept that all credit is bad, then you're going to think Klarna is bad. If you think credit is a good thing, we need it within our society, then you have to figure out, is Klarna a better form of credit or a worse form of credit than other credit systems, right? And I think it probably didn't need 8,500 words, but I think that's a nuanced way of approaching Klarna.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you don't want to be in a position where it's a bit hypocritical that you'll accept credit as a concept, but in this instance, because it's a trending topic, jump on the bandwagon and say no, absolutely not. And then where does the responsibility lie in responsible lending as well? Should that be part of Klarna's mission, or should that be an external stakeholder? And
Yeah.
after you wrote, did you add any of your personal thoughts into it, or was it very much an objective piece that wherever you stand, you have to look at this issue as a whole in terms of like how you feel about credit?
Yeah, no, no, I think it was pretty objective. I think people have asked me since, okay, so I read the piece, I loved the piece, but what do you really think of Klarna? Like, I don't think it gave away my personal opinions. What I do when I did those big pieces at TechCrunch, and I didn't do very many because they didn't really fit into the way I was employed there, right? There wasn't really the time and space to do a lot of those kind of pieces. So when I did them, I would always do them on topics that I was super, super interested in, or a topic where I thought I could bring something entirely different and new to the table. So I didn't reveal what I thought, but I wanted to take the reader on the exact same journey that I went on. So the way I approached it was take them on a journey, explore the history of the company, understand the context of why it existed, understand the problem it was trying to solve, which is why the founders thought it needed to be brought into life, and then explore the issues around regulation, around, is it better than a credit card? Why are millennials not using credit cards anymore? Like, is Klarna's customer the consumer, or is it the retailers they work with? Like, all these very nuanced, subtle kind of grey areas. And I thought if I could take the reader through all the grey areas, but in an accessible way, with access to the founder as well, because I spent about 3 hours with the founder of Klarna, which is like totally unheard of, then they could have their own conclusion. They could reach their own sort of educated opinion, and they don't need my opinion, right? If I've done that, they can make up their own mind.
So it's very much an intentional thing.
Yeah, 100%. And that is always the way I like to do journalism. That was my favorite kind of journalism. Like, take the reader on a journey, and they can honestly, they're smart enough to make up their own opinions. I was never shoving my opinion down people's throats, because honestly, the facts often speak for themselves. Like, that was the other thing I was quite good at, is if in doubt, just print the facts. Nobody ever hates you afterwards. They don't necessarily love you, and you can defend the piece, right? So, I mean, that was, and I tell that to other journalists. Like, if you're worried you can't get a scoop over the line, or you're not sure if it's too strong or not strong enough, just print the facts, and people can take their own, their own takeaway from it.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, one of the most beautiful things about journalism as a whole, that it's about getting the truth out there and making sure that the truth isn't distorted, and giving people that room to make their own judgment based on that. Because, you can lay out the facts and people will have different opinions on that, which I think is, in some cases can cause a lot of problems and be very complex. But on the whole, is fantastic that we don't all think the same way. So I think that's a really great way to approach journalism.
That's an admission of nuance, that nuance exists. Nuance exists because there are grey areas. If there weren't grey areas, there wouldn't be. It's the same thing what I said earlier. There wouldn't be human. Like, humans are complex, misdirected, contradictory beings, right? And I think so. Print the facts. Do your due diligence to get the facts correct. If there is nuance, explain what the nuance could or couldn't be. Put the pros and cons, put the counter arguments, and let the reader make up their mind. The only pushback I would say is there's been a recent trend where often people mistake that for having to have two sides to every story, and that's an absolute red herring, because you don't need to put two sides. If somebody wants to come on air and say the moon is flat, right, you don't need to have that person come on air and say the moon is flat just because a bunch of scientists are saying no, it's round. Like, do you know what I mean? There's a mistake that kind of balance means having 50-50. Balance is the pursuit of the facts in a nuanced, balanced way, where you're open to being, for there being nuance.
What a fantastic note to end on. So, Steve, for anyone that wants to keep up with any writing that you might be doing now, you have a newsletter. Can people follow that?
They could, but it's not really. It's kind of on hold while I help build this amazing new company. So no, they can probably just follow me on Twitter. I still tweet sometimes, just as opinionated and rude as I always ever was. So that's at SO here. And if anyone wants to check out Zapp, which I'm going to plug, visit
Please do.
tryzapp.com. So TRYZAPP.com. Tryzapp.com. And if you DM me and you want like a discount code to try it, we're in London, Manchester, Bristol, and Cambridge in the UK.
That was my next question, locations. Thank you so much, Steve. This was a real pleasure. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
No worries. Thanks for having me.